Welcome to the top of Mars Hill, also known as the Areopagus, at least the English pronunciation. And below us, over here, is the Agora, which is something to do with what we're going to be talking about here. And I'm going to be very brief, mercifully, only because we can't be up here that long right now. But you are probably familiar with Paul's speech to the Athenians. You remember that. Paul ends up in Athens. All of his disciples are someplace else. So he goes down into the Agora, down there. And he's speaking down there and preaching to the people. And somebody hears him and reports it to the people that meet up here, which are, in effect, armchair philosophers. They're, how do we put it, full of hot air. They're very smart. It's a combination of Epicureans and Stoics, but all they do is lazily sit around and debate the latest trends, whether it's philosophical, political, or occasionally religious. And Paul is invited to come up and speak to them, so he does. And he begins his speech, which, of course, they want to find out what this babbler, as they called him, which the word babbler, from the Greek, as you know, is seed picker. So he's a seed picker, and what he's trying to say, and some say that he's advocating foreign gods. But he stands up in the meeting of the Areopagus, so somewhere, wherever this building was in relationship to this mountaintop here, that he stands before all of these Epicurean, Stoic, epic armchair philosophers who sit around and waste their time all day long just talking back and forth about much of nothing. And he says, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." When he said this, I suspect they laughed. It was sort of a way of breaking the crowd in, because they're really not. The Epicureans, they didn't believe in a whole lot. They could believe in the gods, they might not believe in the gods. But the Stoics were pantheists. And they also might believe in reincarnation, they might not. But the whole philosophy by which they lived was essentially a mythological, godless type of a philosophy. It was very strange. So, as he speaks to them, he says, "You're a religious crowd." Breaks the ice. "And for as I walked around, I observed your objects of worship." And of course, you saw a number of these with the Acropolis right here. And if you were to go down into the Agora, all these different places where you could worship down there, and different little altars rather, where they stood. And he said, "I even found an altar with an inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now, what you worship is something unknown. I am going to proclaim to you." Then he goes on, and he talks in their terms about the God who made heaven and earth. This is who this God is. And this is what this God does. And this is what this God did. And he brings it down to Jesus without really ever telling them much about him, but using their own terminology in order to grab their attention. And he did it by talking about this God who he was going to reveal, that you have an altar to this God. He's the unknown God. And they understood what he meant. This is one of those times, crawl inside their heads and listen to what they're hearing. Back in the 3rd century BC, around 420, there was a Cretan philosopher, poet from Crete, who is quoted not just once, but twice in the New Testament. And his name was Epimenides. He came from Crete. And he was here in Athens during what is known as the plague years in Athens, where a terrible, ghastly plague swept through this city and killed so many of its inhabitants in a very gruesome way. It wasn't just like bubonic plague. It was more like, when you read the descriptions of it, it sounds more like a form of Ebola. Just nasty. You bleed out all over the place. It was really, really ugly. And people would go to their gods, they would worship, they would do sacrifices, they would cut themselves, they would do whatever they could to try and appease the gods to heal for this plague. And here is Epimenides. He is here while this is going on. And according to, well, history, legend, it really doesn't matter at this point how accurate this is. The guys up here considered it part of their life. It was part of their culture. It was a story that they believed in. That Epimenides had a dream. And the dream was, get up and find a flock of sheep, both black and white, and take this flock of sheep and let them go down there in the agora. And they would travel around to wherever they're going to go, and when they stop, take one of the sheep, sacrifice it, and the plague will stop. So he does it. He gets up in the morning, he goes down to the agora, finds a flock of sheep. I'm simplifying the story, as you could probably tell, and follows the sheep to where they go, takes one of the sheep when it stops, he makes his own altar to an unknown God. Who is this God? We don't know who this God is, but this God gave him this vision, and so he does the sacrifice, and the plague abates in less than a week. Now, think about this. All the other gods of Athens, all the other gods that were possibly invoked everywhere, all the altars that were down there, up here, and elsewhere, none of those gods could stop the plague. But here is this unknown God that gives Epimenides this vision. He does a sacrifice, and the plague stops in days. It's gone, which is why they preserved this altar. And there were several altars to this unknown God, because all the other gods did what they did, but this God had real power. This God could stop the deadliest thing that's ever happened to the Athenians from the inside out. And so he brings up this unknown God, and he immediately has their attention, because this was the God that could deliver. He's the one that could do things. So this is how he got their attention. And this was the unknown God that he declared to them, and they listened until he gets all the way to the end, where he begins to talk about Jesus, who was crucified, and then, the punchline, rose from the dead. And these guys just went crazy, because that's ridiculous to them. They're hardcore rationalists. They didn't believe in a resurrection in the least, and so they immediately rose in an uproar and rejected him. The man is definitely foolish, and he's gotten silly now, but he had our attention for a while. And a few people ended up believing. Some from the Areopagus ended up believing. And even other people, some women, came along and they believed too. And the church in Athens began, and it was here, and it did go for a while. Did it flourish? We don't know much about what happened here, but it was here. And then Paul finally moves on to Corinth, where he meets up with the other apostles, the other disciples rather. So this was Mars Hill, and this is where this event happened. And again, it has to do with this fellow, Epimenides. Also, he shows up another time, not by name, but by what is said in the book of Titus, where Paul makes this alarming statement to Titus on Crete, where he says all Cretans are liars and all brutish, and he goes on and on. This is a quote from Epimenides, who was a Cretan. And of course, it was a type of philosophical quote that Epimenides made that was sort of a self-contradictory quote just to get your brain going. And I'm not going to go into all of that. It's just a very interesting philosophical conundrum that was brought up in that statement. And Paul quotes him there too, which tells us that Paul, the Pharisee, the Hebrew of Hebrews, the Pharisee of Pharisees, he also knew Greek history and Greek philosophy and Greek poetry. And so he brings it up here, right where we're sitting right now in this area, within earshot of this. And he brings it up also to Titus, who is on Crete, and he quotes it. Not wrong to quote people like that. Well, I want to quote somebody, and I want to end with this, if you don't mind. So let me get my device out here. As I said, the Stoics were pantheists. Well, somebody wrote something very interesting, and I'm going to edit it down here because it's long, so I'm going to shorten it drastically. But what he said was this. This is a modern fellow who said, the pantheist's God does nothing, demands nothing. He is there if you wish for him, like a a book on a shelf. He will not pursue you. There is no danger that at any time heaven and earth should flee away at his glance. An impersonal God? All well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, and goodness inside our own heads? Better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap. Best of all. But God himself, alive, pulling at the other end of the cord, perhaps approaching at an infinite speed, the hunter, the king, the husband, that's quite another matter. There comes a moment when children who have been playing burglars suddenly hush. Was that a real footstep I heard in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion, who said they were searching for God, suddenly draw back. Supposing we had really found him. We never meant it to come to that. Worse still, suppose he has found us. C.S. Lewis, Miracles. Amen and amen. Welcome to Mars Hill.